If anyone watching this is the one who kidnapped Katie, please don't hurt her. Release her and let her go back to her family. In one of the small towns in Indiana, a little girl suddenly and mysteriously disappeared. It was a very atypical event for this quiet and safe area, but perhaps everything was just an appearance. Just starting this investigation, we're going to find anyone who had anything to do with it. The disappearance of little Katie Coleman has opened a whole chain of mysteries and has the town's residents looking at everyone around them with suspicion. We're not going to stop. The case will never be closed until we find the answers. 10-year-old Katie Coleman was supposed to return home hours ago. Her father, John Coleman, called the police saying she was last seen at 3:15 p.m. 4 hours had passed, and it was now 7:30 p.m., and Katie had not returned. Her parents were frantic with worry, organizing their own searches, searching every house, garage, and business in town. This was necessary because Crothersville, Indiana, was a small town of only about 1,500 residents. The police officers arrived at the scene and began to reconstruct the day in Katie's journey. John Coleman had woken his daughter up in the morning, taken her to school, and dropped her off as usual. He had hugged and kissed her, told her he loved her, and that they would see each other later. Everything was normal. It was just a regular morning for the Coleman family. After school, when Katie had returned home, her mother, Angie Coleman, sent her daughter to pick up groceries at a nearby store. This was also normal, because Crothersville was a small, safe town where children could walk the streets before dark without worrying. Residents often left their doors unlocked and everyone knew each other. Katie had lived in the town most of her life. The Coleman family was simple, but happy. Katie's mother, Angie, was a housewife, and her father, John, worked at a local copper wire factory. Katie often visited her father's workplace and helped him in any way she could. John called her his cute little monkey and best friend. He was very proud of his close relationship with his daughter. At around 3:30 p.m., Katie left home to go to the store. It was later learned that someone had seen her walking along the railway tracks with a shopping bag around 4 p.m. She was on her way home when she suddenly disappeared just a few hundred meters from home. Detective Rob Simpson joined the search because he had years of experience working cases involving children. Rob talked to John and Angie, trying to find out if Katie might have stopped by a friend's house or purposely gone somewhere and not come home right away. These things can happen, especially if there are problems at home. However, the Coleman family insisted that Katie would never leave without telling anyone. Furthermore, her parents were certain that this was not their daughter's nature. She knew that she was loved and that her family was waiting for her at home. As news of Katie's disappearance spread throughout Crothersville, local residents joined the police in the search. Later, a shopper at the store where Katie had been said that she might have been attracted to an injured dog. So this person said that, on that day, a dog had been hit by a car and was lying near the railway tracks and that Katie had recognized the dog. She knew who the dog belonged to, and out of kindness and concern, she probably went to the dog's owner's house to tell them. The police asked everyone in the area, trying to find the dog's owner or anyone who might have seen Katie, but it was getting dark and Katie's father was in despair. The search continued, but as the night wore on, the parents' hopes dwindled. In those moments, it felt like nothing good was coming. The next morning, after 18 hours of relentless searching, Katie was still nowhere to be found, and there were no additional witnesses to where she might have gone. Detective Simpson assumed that someone had picked Katie up in a car near the store and driven her away from Crothersville, but her parents disputed that, saying they had taught their daughter never to get into a car with a stranger unless the bad guy had forced her into the car by force. Katie, we're waiting for you to come home. We're doing our best. It had been a day since Katie had gone missing, but there had been no leads. The local police had to call in the FBI since Crothersville was only about 40 miles from the Kentucky border. The possibility that Katie had been abducted and taken out of state put the case under the jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI had a lot of resources to investigate, and they assembled a team led by Agent Tony Siddle, a 25-year veteran. Siddle and Simpson focused on the Coleman family's life, When a child goes missing, investigators are forced to assume the worst, that one or both of the child's parents might have something to do with the disappearance. They interviewed John and Angie several times, trying to find any discrepancies in their stories. But nothing about the couple's words or actions seemed suspicious. We're just starting our investigation and we're going to find out. After Katie Coleman went missing, the FBI and Detective Simpson finally got their first big lead. A witness called the police station and said she saw a little girl sitting in a white pickup truck. So the woman didn't recognize the driver, but she had seen Katie twice. The pickup truck initially drove past her, then turned around on the dead-end road and drove in the opposite direction, which made her notice the vehicle, even though white Ford F-150 pickups were common in the area. This happened between 4:30 and 5 p.m., the day Katie went missing. Detectives quickly contacted the vehicle registry to find a list of white Ford F-150 owners in the area. They were especially looking for people with criminal records to narrow down the list of possible child abductors. Each person on the list was approached and questioned. The witness could not give a detailed description of the driver, but she remembered him as a thin white man who might have been wearing glasses. Based on this description, detectives created a sketch. When Katie's father saw the sketch, he was shocked to see that the man in the drawing closely resembled a neighbor of the Coleman family. The man was Elvin Terry, who lived alone in his old, dirty mobile home. Other neighbors also described Elvin as strange, lonely, and somewhat anxious. And most notably, a local resident overheard Elvin joking about a girl being locked in a makeshift cellar he had built under the stairs of the mobile home. It may have been a creepy prank, but the person immediately reported it to detectives. Detective Simpson believed that this strange man might be holding Katie hostage, so they decided to question him and search the house. When they entered, they were shocked by the stench. Elvin Terry even peed in the vases around his bed because he was too lazy to go to the bathroom at night. And upon closer inspection, they found many suspicious items such as duct tape, binoculars, and other items that could be used to hold someone captive. However, after a thorough investigation, the police found no evidence that Elvin had anything to do with Katie's disappearance. He was just a strange person, and although he seemed suspicious, there was no indication that he had committed a crime. This added to the frustration of the detectives, and they were also unable to track down the white pickup truck that witnesses had seen Katie in. In desperation, the investigation was expanded to the media. Katie has been missing for 3 days. If someone has her, please don't hurt her. Let her return to her family. During this time, Katie's parents endured the pain and suspicion of the townspeople, who began to suspect that they had something to do with their daughter's disappearance. You keep thinking about it, a million things going through your head. Every time the phone rings, I hope it's her. Unfortunately, the Coleman family's hopes of seeing Katie alive were not realized. A patrol officer driving past Succo Lake, also known as Cypress Lake, about 14 miles north of Crothersville, saw something strange floating in the water near a culvert. It was something blue. He stopped and walked closer, realizing it was a jacket, apparently belonging to a child. As he got closer, he saw arms and hair. It was Katie Coleman, lying face down in the water. And even seasoned law enforcement officers couldn't talk about the discovery without a tremor in their voices. It was a child, just an innocent 10-year-old. Hope was gone. What if the monster who did this to Katie is still out there? Katie's body showed no obvious signs of violence, so she was taken to a medical examiner's office to determine the cause of death. Meanwhile, detectives began combing the area around the lake for clues. Evidence was being sorted and analyzed, and the investigation continued to work tirelessly to find a suspect. Katie's hands were tied in a special knot, a type of knot that gets tighter as the victim tries to escape. This led detectives to believe that the kidnapper was either a hunter or someone familiar with traps. The local detectives and the FBI were shocked by the horrific scene. It made them more determined, as if they could not let the person who treated Katie like prey escape. And we cannot ignore this. We are human beings. We are parents, they said. We will not stop. The case will never be closed until we find the truth. Simpson began investigating possible hunters or trappers who lived near Crothersville and ran through the crime lists of people who had been active in the area. Eventually, they found someone who fit the profile. However, after questioning and examining the evidence, the man had a clear alibi. He was at work, and his employer confirmed this. At this point, the results of the medical examiner's office showed that Katie's lungs were full of water, confirming that the cause of death was drowning. There were no signs of trauma, bruises, or abrasions on her body. Investigators and her family were somewhat relieved that at least Katie had not been abused before her death. But this also raised a big question: so what was the motive? Why? This was not a grown woman who could make enemies. This was just a child. The Coleman family and the FBI were both trapped in a depression. They had too many questions and no answers. The pickup truck had not been found, the suspects had alibis, and even the search for the injured dog had turned up no leads. But 3 days after Katie's body was discovered, the detectives received a surprising confession. Unexpectedly, DNA taken from semen on Katie's body matched DNA on a cigarette found near Cypress Lake. A single cigarette, seemingly meaningless among hundreds of other clues, became extremely important evidence. First, it proved that Katie's abuser had been at the lake with Chucky Hickman, the man who had killed her. Second, this cigarette might help find the culprit. At the time, cigarette manufacturers printed their brand names on cigarette paper, and the brand on this cigarette was Roger Light. This was a fairly rare brand in the area, which helped narrow down the investigation. Detective Rob Simpson checked stores within a 50-mile radius of Crothersville and found that Roger Light cigarettes were sold in only 4 locations. Simpson went to each store and asked them to report if anyone came in to buy Roger Light cigarettes. Within a week, Simpson's efforts paid off. A store employee called to say that a man had just bought a whole case of Roger Light Cross, and, more importantly, he had arrived in a white Ford F-150 pickup truck. Detective Simpson immediately ran a vehicle registration check and discovered that the car belonged to a man named Anthony Stockelman, who lived in Seymour. Detectives had met with Anthony 3 months earlier, shortly after Katie went missing. At that time, Stockelman confessed that he had seen Katie near the train tracks but did not know what had happened to her, nor had he seen her talking to anyone else. The detectives initially believed him because Stockelman was a 40-year-old married man with children who worked at a local factory. Nothing had ever made the detectives suspicious of Anthony at the time. He even agreed to take a lie detector test, but due to fatigue from a night shift, he failed the test, although there were no obvious signs of lying. Now the detectives wanted to interview Anthony again. When Simpson arrived at Anthony's house, he found several Roger Light cigarettes strewn around the yard. Anthony met the detectives at the door and said, "I told you about this." Of course, Anthony denied any involvement and claimed that he had not been to the lake in years, even though it was less than 3 miles from his home. Anthony even had an alibi. His wife claimed that Anthony had come home between 5 and 5:30 p.m., the exact time detectives believed Katie had died. Despite the overwhelming evidence linking Anthony to the car and the cigarette pack, the detectives were unable to immediately arrest him. They took a DNA sample from Anthony for analysis. After several days of tense waiting, the DNA results came back in. Anthony's DNA matched the DNA taken from the Annie and from the semen. Furthermore, Anthony had a fairly unique genetic profile, which completely eliminated the possibility of error. There is no doubt that Anthony Stockelman was the one who abused Katie. However, what is puzzling is that it has been more than 2 months since Chucky Hickman was arrested for admitting his involvement in Katie's death. So what is the connection between Chucky and Anthony? Is Chucky Hickman lying about his role? Detectives are trying to reconstruct the entire incident to determine the extent of Chucky's involvement. They dig into every detail of where Chucky was in the days before and after Katie's disappearance, and they make a crucial discovery. Chucky was with several other people during that day, far from the crime scene. He could not have been at the lake and participated in Katie's death. Once they determined that Chucky Hickman's testimony and confession were false, the police realized that everything Chucky told them was a lie. However, he never explained why he made up the story. It's possible that Chucky lied under the influence of drugs, or that he just wanted to get the attention of the police. Whatever the reason, Chucky Hickman had no role in Katie's death. However, the evidence still pointed to Anthony Stockelman's involvement in Katie's abuse, not her death. That's when another witness came forward and said that on the day Katie disappeared, there were 2 other people in Anthony's car in addition to her. Armed with this information, forensic examiner Paulita Meg once again combed through all the evidence from Anthony's pickup truck, looking for traces of other DNA or any other evidence. Paulita carefully analyzed the smallest evidence and finally came to the conclusion Anthony's car had only 2 repeated DNA samples from items, Anthony's and Katie's. There was no trace of Anthony's relatives, no trace of his wife or children. This led detectives to wonder if Anthony could be the only person responsible for both Katie's abuse and murder. The forensic examiner remembered the knot in the rope that had bound Katie's hands, the knot that had kept her from escaping. Although the rope had been washed away by the lake water for 5 days, there was still hope that the killer might have left skin cells behind when tying the knot. Skin cells are tiny and hard to detect, but Paulita patiently took samples from the rope, trying to squeeze each strand to the core to find traces of skin stuck between the fibers. 3 days later, the results came. Paulita had done the impossible. She had succeeded in taking DNA samples from the skin cells on the rope, and the results were a 100% match to Anthony Stockelman's DNA. It was Anthony who had tied Katie's hands. It was he who had caused her death and her cruelty. The local community was shocked and horrified by the discovery. It was hard to believe that an ordinary-looking man with no criminal record like Anthony Stockelman could have committed such a heinous crime. He seemed to be just another ordinary man living nearby, not arousing any suspicion. However, Anthony's arrest revealed the brutal truth. He had ruined the life of an innocent child. Anthony Stockelman refused to provide any further details about his crimes and showed no remorse or emotion. However, detectives tried to piece together the full picture of the case, and finally, when faced with the death penalty, Anthony confessed to his crimes. He confessed to the crime to avoid the death penalty and agreed to a life sentence. On the day Katie disappeared, Anthony had been helping his mother pack her things because she was moving. Anthony's mother's house was on the street Katie often took on her way home from the store. The first time he saw Katie pass by, an evil thought occurred to Anthony, a dark fantasy. He waited for her to return like a spider waiting for its prey. When Katie passed by again, Anthony lured her into his mother's house, led her into the bedroom, and raped her. After abusing Katie, Anthony pushed her into his white pickup truck and drove out of town. On the way, he drove past witnesses who had seen Katie in the car twice. Detectives now understood why Katie did not appear frightened. She was so shocked that she was silent and unresponsive. When they reached the lake, Anthony pushed Katie out of the truck and threw her into the cold water. He calmly smoked a cigarette, watched the girl sink, then turned the car around and returned home to have dinner with his family. Anthony Stockelman was later convicted of the abuse and murder of Katie Coleman. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole or early release. Shortly after Anthony was incarcerated, another horrific incident occurred. A 22-year-old named Jared Harris tattooed the words "Revenge for Katie" on Anthony's forehead. Jared Harris, who was Katie's cousin, was sentenced to an additional 7 years in prison for this act, even though he was only months away from completing his sentence. But Jared showed no remorse for his actions, as protecting the honor of his poor cousin was the most important thing to him. After Katie's death, her parents and the community of Crothersville decided to build a children's playground in her memory. Katie's memory is painful, but no one in this town wants to forget this sweet little girl.